Hi, I'm sitting in my patio, and this is just a totally unscripted, unplanned, impromptu video with some thoughts about things that happened in history because of what's going on today. Today is July 18th, a Saturday, 2026. So apparently, a couple of Americans have been killed in the war overseas in Iran. I'm not sure where they died, but they're dead. And from what I understand, that brings the total of dead American troops to 15. Mm, Let's hope it stops there. I don't believe it will. But uh, I want to put in perspective something that happened in 1973. I'm not sure of the exact date. It was in October, I believe, during what the Israelis call the Yom Kippur War. And this is seen in history as a victory ultimately for them, which I don't believe it was in many ways. It was a serious defeat, and it could have foreseen what they're going to experience now, and should. Anyway, uh, there apparently were a few hours warning that the sneak attack was coming from Syria and Egypt, and the capabilities of the Arab enemies of Israel. They were enemies because Israel wanted them to be enemies, frankly, uh, has always been dismissed, has been disrespected. Now, just because I care about history and know quite a lot about it, I'm going to tell you from my own perspective what happened that day and the succeeding days. Egypt had, in the person of now Sadat, Anwar Sadat, a lot to recover from, given what was done to them during the 1967 Six-Day War by Israel. And they were a very proud society then and now. Very complicated politics, but let's put that aside. They were and are an amazing military force, one of the strongest in the area. I'm afraid Turkey is far superior for many reasons, not for lack of trying. But in any case, let's go back to what happened then. So the uh, the Egyptians and the Syrians knew very well that they could not sustain an attack in force for any length of time. Their supply lines would be extended, certainly in the case of Egypt, across the Suez Canal. This was unsustainable over the long haul. And what they were trying to do is make a deep penetration into their own, well, what was their own territory until 1967, the Sinai, and to make a serious attempt at getting it back. Now, I don't believe they had any realistic expectation of doing that, but they're going to deal a serious blow, and they had some hope of making it happen. So they tried it. And what they pulled off was amazing because the Israelis, that the day, and again, forgive me, I don't recall the exact date. It was in October 1973 that the attack occurred across the canal. The Israelis had roughly 200 some odd soldiers guarding the entire front of the Suez Canal, which was quite an extended distance, more than 100 miles. And this was called the Bar-Lev line of fortifications, and each one was very thinly manned, 13 of them, and maybe a total of just over 200 men. And they had some tanks in the rear, a few dozen tanks, which were a quick reaction force if they had enough time to activate them. And much, much further back, they had more men and more equipment. But they happened to be hit on Yom Kippur. That's why it's called the Yom Kippur War, at a time when Israel was very much not in a ready position militarily to respond to a sudden invasion, which apparently, with some forewarning, they now knew was coming, but not with enough time to mobilize. So the Egyptians knew they had this not huge force to get through, and believe it or not, one of these Bar-Lev force held out to the end of the war, but only one. And they had to get through the enormous fortifications the Israelis had built up on their side, which were these enormous sand berms, which are just enormous piles of sand, which are in some cases over 100 feet high and that thick and thicker. And their engineers thought about using explosives on these, and it was ridiculous because you could move tons of sand in such an enormous fortification. It's just going to shift around from one location to another. The base will still be solid, and you can't get through that. You can't get tanks up a wall of soft mud. So they had to find another solution, and they found it. They bought these high-pressure water hoses, water cannons from a West German company. And they moved these over on barges over the canal, along with, by the way, over 150,000 men over the next couple of days via boats and 11 pontoon bridges that their engineers threw across the canal. Wow. This was a really organized force, a big force. So they went after these sand berms with these West German water cannons and cut through them like a hot knife through butter. And their men were across in force, on foot, with tanks, and with lots of weapons. And they had with them these new Russian anti-tank man-portable missiles called Sagers, anti-tank missiles. And this could easily be set up and carried by 2 men for aim in the desert. And so their men got into the interior, these 2-man teams with larger units flooding the interior. And when they encountered the Israeli defensive tank units, whoa, what a surprise. Hello, out of nowhere they get hit by these Russian anti-tank missiles. But that's not all. They had temporary mastery of the sky because they also had these, again, Russian anti-aircraft missiles, these SAM missiles, which were extremely effective. And I believe during the first 4 days of the war, the Israelis lost about 98 aircraft in Syria theater and in the Suez theater, and maybe more, but at least 98 aircraft. And this meant there was basically a no-fly zone if they didn't want to be knocked down. So if you don't have aircraft and your tanks are going to be easily attacked by land troops and 2-man teams of land troops, your armor is taken out, you have a serious problem. So the Israelis knew they had a very short time to deal with this problem. And here is what happened. Apparently at the urging, and I hear 2 ways on this, that Kissinger was opposed to rearming the Israelis, but Haig, Alexander Haig, who was the commander of the American forces in the West German, in the European theater at that point, said, no, you have to resupply the Israelis, and you have to send them everything we've got. And he apparently stripped the American European forces of armor, weapons, fuel, ammo, and without authorization started sending it in huge C-5 Galaxy shipments to the Israelis. And so Nixon is faced with the choice of backing up Haig in opposition to the advice of Kissinger, and what is he going to do? So it's a fact that it was already accomplished. I mean, these flights were already landing in Israel, and he apparently approved it after the fact because he felt he had no choice, which makes some sense. In any case, where to go next? I can edit and cut out this pause, so let me think about what I'm going to say next while I keep rolling. All right, so we have a situation where the resupply flights are landing in. Oh, yes, I remember. Now, the Russians have become aware of what's going on. And so the Israelis realize they got a big problem. And they don't necessarily see much of a way to stop the invasion. They were afraid that it could actually succeed, taking back not only the Sinai, But at one point in the north, they had a single Israeli tank holding off about 100 Syrian tanks. And due to the time of day, the terrain, the situation, that last Israeli tank destroyed enough of the Syrian armor in that particular attack to stop the attack. Amazing that a single tank can make such a difference. And, well, it did. This is what I hear. And there are lots of videos supporting it from the actual people involved. The tank crew has testified on YouTube. I've seen it, to what they did with that Syrian opposition armor. And these guys were good, these Syrian tankers. I mean, the fact that this tank survived to hold them off was in itself an amazing thing. So the Israelis are now feeling desperate, and so they apparently rolled out some, and I've heard this story two ways, and it could be either way, some A4 aircraft or F4 Phantom IIs, both of which were nuclear capable, to an airstrip in Beersheba. And they loaded them up with their nukes, which they definitely had, which they had stolen. They had stolen the nuclear material and the plans from the United States, from an American plant in Pennsylvania, with the, because I don't know what the word to use, connivance of the CIA, knowledge of the CIA, or parts of it, like a very higher up man, the head of operations at the time, from what I understand, James Jesus Angleton. He was intimately involved in getting the Israelis the nuclear material, but I digress. So here we are, and they photographed the aircraft on the airstrip, and not only that, they send a satellite overhead, and I believe they've obtained satellite imagery, and they sent that to the Americans as well, and made sure Nixon saw it. And he got the message, because the Russians also apparently heard this, because they said immediately, you know something, this goes on, we're going to send troops. We will send in however many troops immediately to stop this whole thing. And that, boy, that was getting out of hand, so it had to be stopped. And in any case, the Israelis' defense was competent enough that lone tank in the north gave them enough time to move more tanks in overnight and resupply, that the Syrians never were able to get another serious chance to penetrate the Galilee and get into the valley below and run rampant inside Israeli territory, which I really wish had happened at this point, because it would have saved the lives of so many people in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, everywhere that the Israeli murder machine has caused death and mayhem and murder and destruction. Now, one of my earlier videos was labeled a rant about a silly thing. Okay, so this is a rant too. But this is a serious rant about history. The Yom Kippur War, 1973, the October War. Egyptian military capabilities, Israeli military capabilities, and this is the truth. And Israeli military invincibility is a myth. I mean, they're barely holding on. They lost 22 officers last week in a single attack by Hezbollah in Lebanon, which, of course, they don't want this information to get out. And in the traditional media, it doesn't. It isn't reported on. But in the real media, the ones I pay attention to, the alternative quote-unquote media, the information gets out. And as the former president, and once, I believe, before he was president, representative from Illinois in Congress said, Abraham Lincoln, you can fool some of the people all the time, some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I believe this is the point we are at now in this country. I'm approaching 15 minutes. I'll probably cut some of my ramblings and hesitations out. The point is that we have arrived at the point now that the Israeli propaganda machine, the Zionist murder propaganda machine, is no longer going to work on the majority of the American public. Does this mean we're going to be successful in stopping the funding of this horrible murder machine? No, I don't think so. However, we have to say the truth. And maybe we can get lucky and stop it somehow. Enough of us will put our feet down politically. Because I asked the mayoral candidate in the largest Illinois city to her face, does she support the Israeli Zionist murder machine? And to her credit, she at least answered me truthfully. And I warned her ahead of time, I'm a single issue voter. And she said, yes, I'm an Israel supporter. And I said, have a good afternoon. I hope you lose. And I walked away from her. Maybe it was not the most courteous thing to do, I understand, but I'm sick and tired of courtesy in the face of hundreds of thousands of murders. Are we clear? Thank you for enduring my rant. And in the words of another channel who I respect so much, Louis Rossmann, Rossmann, now of Texas, Taylor, Texas, formerly of New York City, I hope you learned something. I hope I'm able to impart something of what I know and care about and understand to be a fact from history so far as I can determine it. Have a great day. Thank you.